Welcome back. So if I can welcome Alex Edmonds on stage. He's Professor of Finance at London Business School, and he's done some absolutely fascinating research on companies with a pie splitting versus a pie growing mentality and what this means for long-term growth. Alex, if I could just start with if you could explain the theory and what were your key findings from this research?
Yeah, well, first, Tom, thanks so much for having me on. It's really great to be here. So what do I mean by the pie, and how does this relate to investors? So we often think that ESG factors, so how much we care about the environment and workers and so forth, this we see as at the expense of profit sometimes. So this is the value the company creates is a pie, and anything we give to workers or the environment might be at the expense of shareholders. And that's why, unfortunately, some business leaders do try to minimize the wages to workers or to reduce their pensions. But the idea of pie growing is that when you treat workers well or when you invest in society, this doesn't split the pie differently. It grows the pie, so ultimately investors benefit. So why does that matter? Well, if you're a business leader, actually caring about society supports profit rather than being at the expense of profit. And if you're an investor, these factors are important, not just if you're a responsible investor, but any mainstream investor should want to take these into account.
So what sort of factors should you be taking into account as a business leader then?
Yeah, so this is very important in order to look at the evidence, because we can't go to the other extreme. So some will say, well, every ESG factor pays off. And we have a little bit of confirmation bias, right? We would like to believe that every ethical company does better, but actually the evidence is much more nuanced. So one of my own papers looked at employees, so how you treat your workers, and I got 28 years of data to do that. And importantly, those 28 years included the financial crisis, they included September the 11th. And that's important because some people think that ESG is only a luxury. Well, right now we're in a pandemic and we should focus on just survival. But actually what my research showed was that treating employees well pays off even in a downturn. It's not just a luxury to be enjoyed in crisis times. But I think when you go beyond when you go beyond employees, it becomes much more nuanced. And so one big factor is materiality. So how important is the environment to the company's business? For example, like climate change is something that you and I, and I'm sure all of the audience really cares about. However, it's more material in some sectors than others. So clearly if you're energy or transport, that might matter. But if you're a bank, at least your direct effect on the environment might not be so high. Maybe what's even more important is customer trust. So you don't want to be in a payment protection insurance scandal. So what that means is that if you're a bank, maybe the dimension that you want to really do well on is customer trust or data privacy rather than something like the environment. So you want to tailor the ESG factors that you look at to your specific business model.
So it sounds like you shouldn't just be doing ESG just for the sake of doing ESG. It really depends on what sector you're in, etc.
Yeah, so this is something that is important to be business critical. And this is one of the dangers is sometimes you might have a CEO who just does ESG for good image. And we know about the problem of greenwashing, where you do something because it happens to be the order of the day, when I think a really responsible leader should not swing in the wind and focus on whatever issues in the media. Instead, every business is not here to solve all of the world's problems. Instead, you're here to focus on a specific set of problems that your company has the best expertise in solving. Maybe I'll just give an example of that just to make this a bit more concrete. So let's take Coca-Cola. So they have an initiative called Project Last Mile. And this is an initiative where they distribute medicines and vaccines everywhere in Africa. And it's called Project Last Mile because sometimes getting to the last mile to a school or hospital is difficult. So why do they choose to focus on that rather than climate change or diversity, all of these other important factors? Because it's got real expertise in logistics, because it needs to make sure that Coke is available everywhere in Africa, including the last mile. And then you might think, well, why don't they distribute books? Because literacy is a challenge in Africa. But why they focus on medicines and vaccines is that they need to be distributed cold. And they've got a particular expertise in refrigerated transportation. So I think that's a great example of a company thinking, no, we don't need to be all things to all people. We want to exploit our expertise and our core competencies to address the challenges that we are uniquely placed to solve.
And could you give an example of also a pie splitting mentality and why that is a bad way to go if you are focusing on ESG factors?
Yeah, absolutely. So a pie splitting mentality is the idea that what we give to workers is at the expense of shareholders. So if you think about perhaps the most successful management innovation of the 20th century, this was the assembly line that Henry Ford came up with, right? This was a way of squeezing as much effort as possible out of your employees by forcing them to keep up with the pace of production. And while it did get them to do routine tasks, what we really care about now in 2020 is a lot of intangible tasks. So while this sort of command and control approach can work for just following instructions, it can't work for creativity. And you might think, well, why am I bringing up this 1920s example a century later? But even nowadays, people do have this pie splitting mentality. So in my former career, I was an investment banker. I started off as an analyst, which is right at the bottom. And one day, the vice president caught me laughing, and he said, Alex, you cannot laugh in the office because if you laugh, my boss, the managing director, will think I'm not a good boss because I'm not working you hard enough. And so even in like today, investment banking, we think sort of a great manager is one who squeezes as much as possible out of her employees. Just like Sir Alex Ferguson was a great football manager because the players would come off the pitch sweating and exhausted. But in fact, that is not necessarily the way to treat our employees. And I think one of the small silver linings out of this really bad pandemic is we recognize that actually employees can be trusted. We don't need to monitor them all the time. So the idea that we need to squeeze as much possible out of them is not supported by the data.
And in terms of sort of splitting the E, S and G, what have you found is the most sort of important factor for long-term growth? Because a lot of focus does get put on the E and the G, but the S sometimes gets left behind. Is this something you've seen?
Yeah, so the most of the evidence here is actually for the G, a bit unfortunately, because I personally care about the S. But I think that's only because the G has got a lot of attention from even from the 1990s, people cared about the governance. Actually, from the 1980s, we had the problems like RJ Nabisco and Barbarians at the Gate of managers flying around in corporate jets and so forth. So people do understand the importance of governance. But I think the importance of governance is not too surprising, right? Even if you care only about shareholder value, you would care about governance because it's a way of making sure that managers maximize shareholder value. I think the more nuanced ideas is the E and the S, because that's the idea that if you move away from a shareholder value, it might actually ultimately benefit shareholder value in the long term because it could lead to companies making these investments in E and S and then ultimately improving their long-term performance. And here, the evidence is sort of more mixed. It is certain dimensions are generally universally important, like employees, but others tend to be much more specific to the industry. And within the E, there is a challenge here because people mix up two different things. So we often think about E, environmental risks. And it's indeed the case that certain industries will be affected by climate change, such as if you're in agriculture or if you're in insurance, then you're going to be having to pay out if there's a lot of flooding. But that's a little bit different from environmental emissions. So how vulnerable you are to climate change is different from how much you contribute to climate change. Now, what is it that an investor should care about? It depends on his or her ultimate objective. So if you thought purely from a money maximizing perspective, you would care about environmental vulnerability, right? Whether you're affected by it, not so much how much you cause it. But if you care about this from a more altruistic perspective, maybe you're a pension fund, you might care more about the contribution to climate change, not your sensitivity. But I think we always need to think about, before we decide what ESG approach to adopt, why are we doing it? Is it we're doing ESG because we believe it leads to long-term shareholder value maximization? If so, it's vulnerability that matters. Or are we doing it because of some altruistic perspective? And if so, maybe it's contribution to climate change that matters. And regardless of your objective, depending on your objective, that determines how best to implement it.
And on the S side, you say there's sort of mixed evidence. Could you sort of run through what both sides are seeing in terms of the academic literature and what you found as well?
Yeah, so I've told you about one positive S factor, which is how well you treat your employees. But one factor which is quite misrepresented is pay inequality within a firm. So there is evidence saying that, well, the higher the pay ratio between the CEO and employees, the worse the performance, because that suggests that there's inequality. And in fact, I was testifying in the House of Commons a few years ago. There was an inquiry into corporate governance, and the witness before me quoted evidence claiming that higher inequality leads to worse performance. But actually what the witness focused on was some half-finished evidence. So a work in progress paper. Now the finished paper was actually published, and after the finished paper went through peer review, it found completely the opposite result. So it corrected all its mistakes and it found the opposite. But this shows the importance of being really rigorous with the evidence, because it's always possible to find a half-finished study which supports what you'd like to support. And we all would like to have the idea that more equality is better for long-term performance. And indeed, the World Economic Forum, as you, I'm sure lots of the audience have seen, they proposed, when they came up with their stakeholder metrics a few weeks ago, they proposed the pay ratio as being a measure. But in fact, that is not linked to better performance. It's actually the wrong way. And one of the reasons for this is, again, the pie growing versus pie splitting mentality. So some people think, well, the pie is fixed. So if the CEO is paid more, then the rest of the people can't be paid well. But if the pay is set well within the firm, then the way in which the CEO is paid a lot is if she has contributed long-term value to the company, she's grown the pie. So this means that to the extent to which investors look at pay, what really matters is pay linked to long-term performance on lots of dimensions? And if so, then high pay is nothing to be afraid of, because the only way that you can be paid is if she's created value for the long term.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One question we've just had, going back to sort of measurements on social, is how do you measure how companies treat employees? Is it surveys, company disclosure? How hard is that to find that sort of data?
Yeah, so this is really important. This is like the $64,000 question. So there are certainly some outside metrics that you can look at. So what I did in my paper is I looked at this list of the 100 best companies to work for in America, which is published every year in Fortune magazine. We've got similar lists in the UK and around the world, which is good because it's comparable. It's important to know, how do they come up with that measure? They didn't just look at quantitative factors like pay and benefits and hours worked and percentage of women or minorities in the workforce. They actually went out and surveyed the employees themselves. And so I think this is some of the most important things that we can do as investors, is boots on the ground investing, is to meet with management, sometimes to actually tour the workplaces. One really famous investor, Peter Lynch in the US, right? If he invested in Body Shop, he would go to the Body Shop store and see firsthand how customers and workers are being treated. I think that's really important, because we know the dangers of ESG metrics being incomparable. Sometimes they can be manipulated and greenwashed. It might be that a company does not care at all about diversity, but you can put a token minority or a token woman on the board to tick the box. Whereas here, what this involves is coming in and seeing how the company actually treats its workers to the extent possible. And some of the listeners thinking about this might think, well, that's a whole lot of work, right? We would like to use these metrics. But that's precisely the point, right? Because if you could just use these simple metrics, you don't need human investors to do that, right? You could get a computer to just look at this measure. The fact that we need to supplement those measures by talking to management and maybe visiting the company, that still gives an edge for human investors. So there are certainly things that can be automated. And I indeed used to advise a large ETF provider for a couple of years. And there is the advantage that there's not the human judgment factor, but there are some things that do require human judgment and human discretion. So I think the most powerful approach is to start with the data, but understand that the data has some limitations. So when we choose who to hire for our company, we'll look at his or her CV. We might trawl their past experience on social media accounts and whatever, but we will still meet the employee, right? So only once you have the interview can you put all of this data into context. And I think that's the same approach with evaluating a company's ESG performance.
And on that, how as an investor should you go about evaluating a company? I mean, what factors do you need to look for? Does it very much depend on what sector you're in? And how do you avoid that sort of box ticking mentality that companies could have? Yeah.
I think that's a really important point. And I think I think about sort of revisiting our idea of ESG, or purposeful business. So often we view ESG as do no harm. So let's reduce the harm that a company does, reduce its carbon emissions, water usage, number of labor injuries. And that is clearly important. But I think even more important is actively creating value. So let's say Mercedes in the pandemic, they decided to use their precision engineers to make CPAP breathing machines. So that is something that's a less invasive alternative to ventilators. Now, that's not going to boost any ESG rating. It's not going to change sort of their carbon footprint. If it does, it probably will worsen it. But I think some of the best measures of how well a company is serving society is the value you actively create, rather than sort of minimizing harm. Yeah, the latter is still important, but I think the former is what will solve some of the biggest problems of the world. So how do you assess that? I'm afraid there's nothing sort of simpler or more silver bullet than to meet with management and sort of ask them, well, what are you doing in order to address these social problems? Some of them you might not need to meet management to do. Some of them you might look at the annual reports and the sustainability reports, and companies are doing a much better job of disclosing them. But I think it requires human judgment in order to read this, and also to apply this comparative advantage lens that I talked about when I mentioned Coca-Cola. Because what it's really important to do is to ensure that when a company serves society, it is using its expertise. So why is that important? Right, another way in which a company could serve society is it could donate a lot of money to charity. And that's one of the biggest examples of greenwashing that we see. But why is that not a good way? So let's say you and I, Tom, we both invest in, say, Coca-Cola ourselves. Well, they could choose to donate a lot of money to cancer research. But let's say I care about cancer, but you care about climate change.
Yeah.
Now, the better approach would be for Coca-Cola to make more profit and donate that to us as investors. And I would support my cancer charity, and you would support, say Greenpeace. So Coca-Cola has no advantage in picking charitable causes. You and I can do that ourselves, but they do have an advantage in using their logistics expertise to distribute medicines. So I think the really important thing is to understand what a company is doing actively to create value for society, and is this indeed something which it has expertise in doing? And I do think that requires human evaluation, not just looking at particular metrics.
And a big topic of conversation yesterday was just around engagement. How important is engagement and also versus divestment? When do you divest? When should you keep on engaging? What's your kind of thoughts there?
Yeah, so I'm afraid I'm going to give a little bit of the academics answer. It's a bit of both, right? So engagement is valuable, and I think this is again really important for investors, because we often think that we want to have a net zero portfolio, so let's avoid investing in companies with sort of positive carbon footprints and so on. But actually, some of the best value that we can create as investors is to invest in the more problematic companies and then try to engage with them to move towards a decarbonisation. So if you're a doctor, you should treat sick patients, not healthy patients. But unfortunately, there are some investors who try to greenwash themselves and say, look, we've got a net zero portfolio, but that's easy. You can just avoid investing in some of the more problematic areas, even though you could create value by engaging with them. So certainly engagement is important. I think the important thing with engagement is to ensure that the engagement is on an issue which is backed up by the evidence. So sometimes you might engage to reduce the pay ratio. And if you do that, maybe you'll win a lot of headlines, right? People love investors who say, let's suck it to CEOs and make sure they're not paid too much. But I think the better way to reform pay is to say, well, let's change the metric from maybe 3-year performance to 5-year performance. So again, have this pie growing lens when we think about engagement. But we also should recognize that there are limits to engagement, and sometimes divestment is important. But I would say when we think about divestment, it shouldn't be on some more box ticking issues, such as, are you in the alcohol industry or not, or are you producing, are you emitting carbon or not, but more on issues of sort of long-term performance and strategy. So we think about, say, Standard Life. They tried to engage with Carillion. They said, oh, we've got concerns about your debt level and so on. And they tried as hard as they could, but they just didn't succeed because the board was entrenched and was hiding information. And they realized that we're banging our head against a brick wall. We are actually adding value here to our clients by divesting. Right? So sometimes people think, well, if you divest, you're short-termist, you're selling out. But actually, if you've tried to engage first, then that's actually something which is good. But what was important here is what grounded their divestment decision was the analysis of the company's business model. So these sort of deeper factors than saying, oh, we're going to divest from you because you don't have an ethnic minority on the board. Maybe the company doesn't have that, but maybe they're doing a lot of other things to encourage a diversity of thinking throughout the organization. So if we do divestment, it should be on these deeper issues.
We've got about 10 minutes left, so do get your questions into Alex if you have any. Just moving on here, so the $1 million question, or maybe $64,000 question: can you outperform with ESG, incorporating ESG factors?
You can, but I think here that the evidence is more mixed, and that's the evidence. Some of it looks at ESG strategies, and some of it looks at ESG funds. So unfortunately, the general consensus is that ESG funds typically don't beat the market. And so some anti-ESG people use this as sort of proof that ESG doesn't work. But I don't think that is the right approach, because there's lots of different ESG funds. Some might be doing it correctly, some might be doing it incorrectly. So would we ever say, is food good for you? Well, that would be an absurd question, because there's some good food and there's some bad food, right? So just to say, is ESG good, is like saying, is food good? So instead, we would like to look at, well, what are the ESG approaches that work? And then they are the ones based on, certainly for governance, there's quite a lot of evidence there that long-term CEO pay, shareholder rights, CEO chairman separation, that's not an issue in the UK, but it is around the world. Those things are linked to long-term firm performance. With the E, if you're looking, with the S, if you're looking at certain things like employee satisfaction, employee engagement, that works. And then when you look at the other S factors and the E, if you apply a materiality lens, that does work. But certainly we cannot claim ESG always pays off. So some of your readers will have seen this, David Blood and Al Gore op-ed in the Wall Street Journal showing that there is voluminous evidence that ESG always pays off. Okay, that sounds great, and that article's liked and tweeted and reshared because people would like to believe that to be true. But I think the fact that it is more mixed in terms of the evidence, that's actually good news for investors rather than bad news. Because if every ESG factor paid off, like, we wouldn't need investors to do this, right? You could get a computer to do it, or maybe retail investors could do it themselves by avoiding particular companies. But it's the fact that we do need to have this expertise to understand the data in the context of a company, perhaps supplement it with meeting management. That's why I think there's going to be a role for active investment, even in a big data world.
And yeah, so you mentioned avoiding companies. Why potentially is an exclusion strategy not the preferable option here?
So I think for a couple of reasons. So number one, it might be that you're excluding based on the wrong criterion. So one might be the pay ratio. Another one, let me be really careful here, is diversity. So clearly diversity is something I really care about myself. So I would benefit from ethnic diversity initiatives. I care a lot about gender diversity as well. However, some of the evidence is portrayed as saying, there's clear evidence that gender diversity or ethnic diversity always leads to better long-term performance, but that's actually not the case. The evidence is pretty mixed there. And so it might be that if we were to have that lens, then a company would fulfill its diversity box, maybe by putting an ethnic minority on the board, even if he or she doesn't actually contribute to a diversity of thinking, right? It's easy for even a company that doesn't care about diversity to post a black square on Instagram or to put a particular minority on the board. But if diversity actually means trying to create a culture with psychological safety where employees are willing to speak up, actively rewarding innovations that fail, and all those things, then those are the things that investors should think about. Another reason why exclusion might not work is that with exclusion, you have to base it on sort of an objective measure, which you can apply to say, are you in or are you out? And objective measures, they often exclude intangible factors. So again, you could look at, how much do you pay your workers? And obviously pay matters, but pay doesn't capture, is this a safe place to work? Do you get on-the-job training and so on? We could look at the number of new jobs created, but that doesn't say anything about the quality of jobs. So we know with quarterly earnings, that's a bad measure because you could manipulate your quarterly earnings by cutting investment. But that's also true for ESG metrics. is ESG
Okay.
metrics, or particularly tangible metrics, they can also be manipulated. And if you're having an exclusion strategy based on, is your pay ratio greater than this, or is the number of employees jobs created lower than that, or is your carbon emissions greater than a certain amount, then you might be ignoring other things. And just on that last point, just because you asked about carbon previously, some of you will know of this MSCI warming tool, which looks at how much your portfolio is contributing to global warming. Clearly, that's something we really care about. But let's look at some unintended consequences. So I serve on the Responsible Investment Advisory Committee of Royal London Asset Management. We ran that on our own portfolio, and we found that our worst offenders are semiconductor companies. Why? Because when you produce semiconductors, there's this perfluorocarbon is emitted, and that is actually worse than carbon in terms of climate trapping heat. However, semiconductors, they will power a lot of the solutions to global warming. And aside from that, like computer chips, which are used in phones, where if you put a phone in the hand of someone in a developing country, you transform their life. So if you look at sort of this one factor, it could be that the company's doing lots of other good, which you're ignoring. So exclusion typically will focus on a small set of metrics, and it might ignore the actively good element that we discussed earlier, being a key part of a company's responsibility.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I suppose one question leading on from that slightly is, how big of an issue is greenwashing still when incorporating these measures, and what can be done to tackle it? How do investors avoid greenwashing strategies? What's your sort of take there?
Yeah, I think greenwashing is absolutely a problem. And it's so what is greenwashing to begin with? It is companies claiming that they care about responsibility, but not actually genuinely changing how they're running a company. It could be, again, putting a minority on the board to tick a box, or donating a lot of money to Black Lives Matter without addressing diversity issues within the company. But we know the famous sort of adage that if you point a finger at somebody, right, you've got three fingers pointing back at yourself. And so investors like to point their finger and say, oh, company, you're greenwashing. But actually, it's their fault perhaps for being greenwashed. Is that if you think we're going to evaluate ESG by looking at superficial measures of pay ratios or diversity and so forth, then it's you to blame. So I think the best way to address the issue of greenwashing is to understand, yes, these statistics do matter. If I was to see an all-male board, I would be really concerned about that. However, even if a board had gender and ethnic diversity, I might not be fully satisfied, because I might think, well, what is happening throughout the workforce? Is the diversity in the senior management team below the board level? And indeed, were these people who were internally promoted rather than externally hired? So I think the best response for investors is to understand, yes, we do care about these metrics, but let's look behind those metrics to figure out why did they get to this certain ESG performance. Just like if we look at quarterly earnings, high quarterly earnings might be a good thing. It might be high because you've actually innovated products and you've made efficiency gains. Or maybe it's a bad thing because you've cut wages and you've cut research and development. So to understand the why behind the numbers is the reason to address greenwashing, just like it's the way to address manipulation of quarterly earnings for traditional performance measures.
And in terms of diversity, where does diversity become important? Is it around diversity of thought, where in terms for long-term growth? What's your sort of thoughts there?
Yeah, so why does diversity matter? And this is indeed where there is evidence, is diversity of thinking. So there is evidence, obviously, that men and women think differently, and also ethnic minorities might think differently from others. But there's also then other factors in diversity. So there might be diversity of age. So boardrooms do involve a lot of old white men, and we focus a lot on the white men thing, but also the old part does not get so much focus. Indeed, if you have some companies which are focused on more new economy sectors, or where products will matter more, will cater more to the younger generation, we might want to have not everybody in the boardroom, but maybe one voice from that younger generation which gets in there. Also, what's important is not just to have diversity in the boardroom, but is the board culture one that actually allows for a consideration of all thoughts and values. So I've sat on governing bodies where, okay, I might be providing diversity in some particular way, but if the chair of the body is somebody who can sort of ask for your opinion, but never takes into account, where a lot of the decisions are backroom decisions, where a subset of the board will get together outside of the board meeting, then that's particularly problematic. So again, how do we address that? It's difficult to do that with a superficial metric, but it might be, you could ask the board, can you give examples of recent decisions where a dissenting viewpoint led to a decision being taken which was different from what you thought would be taken going into the meeting? Or what are the processes that you use in order to encourage dissenting viewpoints? Amazon, for example, when they have meetings, they don't release the meeting papers beforehand. Why? Because then people will read them, they might discuss them in the hallway, and then maybe if you hear that the boss says something, you might be anchoring on what she says. So instead, what they have is they start every meeting with what they call the golden silence. They give you the briefing papers in the meeting, and then you read it there and then. So there's no opportunity to discuss them beforehand and be skewed by some senior person's view. And then they immediately go to the discussion. So that tries to ensure that you are bringing your own viewpoint genuinely, rather than something which has been tainted by what you know that your boss has said about that issue.
And time is up, but just finally, for a pie-growing mentality, what would you say is the key message?
Yeah, so I think it's to understand that the best measure of social responsibility is not the do no harm issue, it's the actively do good. So what is it that a company can do with the resources that it has at its disposal to create value for society? And that metric is going to be different for different companies. But I'd also finally say for investors, this does matter. So it's not just an optional extra. It does take a lot of effort, but it is something where, if implemented correctly, should lead to long-term outperformance in terms of shareholder returns.
Alex, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much for jumping on and giving us a bit of your insight there.
Thanks so much for having me on, Tom. It's really great to work with you. And after we've done stuff previously with the website and articles, it's great to meet with you as close to in person as we can before the lockdown ends.
Great stuff, Alex. Cheers. So next up, we'll have our first panel of the day, which is focusing on fixed income and ESG.